The next item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number 8985 in the name of Richard Baker on Unite's Back Home Safe campaign. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. However, before we begin this debate, I wish to say to members that there is currently a fatal accident inquiry taking place in relation to the 2009 Super Puma crash, and the Sheriff's determination has yet to be issued. Members should therefore make no reference to the substance of the ongoing inquiry, as it is sub judice. Members should also avoid anything which could be seen as making recommendations to the inquiry and therefore preempting its findings. I now call on Richard Baker to open the debate. 7 minutes, please, Mr. Baker.
Thank you, President Officer. I should begin by saying that I'm confident that all the matters I referred to in my speech and the substance of my speech is fully compliant with that guidance you've just issued ahead of this debate.
I hope so. Thank you. Can
I thank members of all parties who have signed this motion supporting Unite's Back Home Safe campaign. Can I also declare an interest as a member of Unite the Union, and I'm pleased that in the Chamber today are a number of my fellow union members who are offshore reps and who have joined us from Aberdeen for this debate. Their commitment to this campaign is reflected in the fact they bring to this Parliament a petition with over 3,000 signatures backing the measures the Union has promoted to restore the confidence of the workforce in helicopter safety. This confidence was shattered after the tragic crash of Sunborough, in which 4 people lost their lives, the 5th incident of a Super Puma helicopter ditching in just 4 years. And of course, the first of these events was the tragedy which took place in 2009, which all of us will remember all too well, when 16 people lost their lives. In this context, it can be no surprise then that in a survey of its offshore members, Unite found that over 53% of workers said they were not confident in offshore helicopter safety, and 77% also stated their confidence in helicopter safety had decreased in the last 12 months. Helicopter transport is vital to our oil and gas industry, an industry which we all know is of such importance to the Scottish economy. The key goal for all of us, for ministers, for parliamentarians, for trade unions, regulators and, of course, the industry itself, must be to restore confidence in helicopter safety and ensure the safety record is greatly improved. That is what has driven this important and successful campaign by Unite. They have come forward with clear proposals for action to improve safety, which include increased investment to create a larger offshore fleet, changes to the internal seat configuration on offshore helicopters, changes to the design of helicopters used for passenger transfer, and improved survival equipment and training for workers. Presiding Officer, the Civil Aviation Authority review, which followed the crash in August, was published last week. And while it is very far from a final word on this issue, it has been welcomed as a step forward. And this is a mark of the success Unite has had in making its case for safety improvements. Because with this review identifying the need for new prohibitions on flying conditions, changes to onboard seating configurations, and the improvement of emergency breathing equipment for workers, it's proposing measures which Unite has called for as part of the Back Home Safe campaign. The review points the way to a change of culture from competition to collaboration, and that's to be welcomed. It's not to say there has been no element of collaboration up to now, and the Helicopter Safety Steering Group, which includes in its membership John Taylor of Unite and Jake Malloy of RMT, has been an important forum. It's also true that the industry's Step Change organisation, focused on improving safety, has done a huge amount of work. But clearly further measures and more joint working are needed, and the review recommends a set of best practice standard procedures is adopted by operators. It also found that all the helicopter operators reported that customer influence in operational matters was too extensive. The perception that contracts are offered at too short a timescale and awarded on lowest cost is also prevalent. This is a finding the industry must respond to, because the priority has to be safety, not getting the lowest cost contract. So this review is welcome, but it does not, in my view, diminish the requirement for a full independent commission of inquiry into helicopter safety. The call for such an inquiry has been led at Westminster by my colleague Frank Doran MP. It's a call backed by the unions, and in a members' debate I led on this issue last year, the case for such an inquiry was most persuasively made by Tavish Scott. Because the CAA review doesn't answer all the fundamental questions which have been posed by the series of accidents. In particular, there is not enough scrutiny of the work of regulators, who over the years have been reactive rather than proactive. And indeed, to be fair to the CAA, in the report it published itself last week, Chapter 7, it identifies problems in the review process. So I hope ministers will agree there's a need for such an independent inquiry and support this proposal. The final point I wish to raise today, Presiding Officer, is an area which is clearly in the responsibility of ministers here. It relates not to the substance of any fatal accident inquiry, Presiding Officer, but simply to the timing of such an inquiry. If our fatal accident inquiry process as a whole was working properly, we might be having a very different debate today, but it isn't. And it took 5 years for the inquiry into the 2009 crash to be held. I don't believe anyone in this chamber wants those who lost loved ones last year to face such a long wait. And that is why I again urge ministers to support the bill brought forward by Patricia Ferguson to speed up the FAI process. Presiding Officer, the Unite Scottish Secretary, Pat Rafferty, has said 5 ditchings and 20 deaths since 2009 is an unacceptable failing of health and safety. And collectively, we have an obligation to ensure we tackle this serious problem, taking every step possible to help offshore workers get back home safe in the future. These words get to the heart of this debate. Today, the prosperity of our country is founded on the labours of our offshore workers who have to carry out their jobs in harsh environments. We owe it to them and to their families to ensure they do get back home safe. And that's why I hope members will support this important campaign today.
Thank you. Now call on Mark MacDonald to be followed by Alex Johnston.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and can I congratulate Richard Baker on securing this debate and indeed welcome the union representatives who have joined us today. As a member whose constituency contains both the heliport and indeed the the helicopter operators, I feel that I have a keen interest in this issue. But beyond that, many of my constituents, indeed many of my friends and family, are either offshore workers or family and friends of offshore workers, and obviously have an interest in this as well. Prior to today's debate, I haven't personally been contacted in respect of the campaign, but I have been aware of it through the coverage it has generated and also through looking into it in advance of today's debate. And obviously, I take guidance from you, Presiding Officer, in terms of the comments that you made. And I think what I want to do is maybe make some broader comments, which hopefully will fall within the ambit that you'd set out prior to this. I think it would be fair to say that nobody, either in this chamber or indeed within the industry, would want to see a system that was anything other than safe. At the end of the day, we all have an interest in ensuring the safety of those who work offshore. Where there have been issues in the past, it's important that recommendations that are arrived at are acted upon and acted upon swiftly. And I think in the past, the oil and gas industry has been one that has been able to learn its lessons and apply them quickly. Indeed, having spoken to a number of people involved in the health and safety elements offshore, they would say that the industry does indeed take the health and safety requirements extremely seriously, but nobody would detract from the need to look very carefully at the situation and given the accidents that we've seen in recent times, the numbers that we've seen over a fairly short period of time. As a member of the cross-party group on oil and gas, at our last meeting there was a discussion on this which involved Malcolm Webb of Oil and Gas UK and also union representatives. And At that meeting, we were told that there was constructive dialogue ongoing between both the industry and union representatives, and that was reflected from the contributions from both sides. And I think that the work that is being undertaken through both the Helicopter Safety Steering Group and the Helicopter Task Group, which has been re-established to provide a smaller, more focused executive oversight, given the large membership of the Helicopter Safety Steering Group, appears to be being welcomed on all sides of the discussions. Now, as I said before, I don't want to prejudge any outcomes, and therefore I'm not going to take any fixed position on the issues which have been raised both within the campaign and by the member and some of his colleagues. What I will say is that I think we need to await the outcome of the FAI. And, you know, as somebody who previously outlined the personal impact that accident had, not just on myself, but on many of my friends and family, I want to wait and see the outcome of that. And I do accept the point that has been made by the member that it would have been far better had we perhaps had that inquiry prior to now. But we are where we are on that, and we need to await the outcome from that fatal accident inquiry. But my primary focus, Presiding Officer, will always be for the safety of my constituents who work in the offshore sector, because at the end of the day we want to ensure that offshore workers come home safely, and I will await the outcomes of the various inquiries that are ongoing, but at the end of the day, whatever we can do to bring home our offshore workers safely, we should back.
Many thanks. Now call on Alex Johnson, to be followed by Tavish Scott.
I thank the Deputy Presiding Officer. It's a welcome opportunity to raise a number of issues that have been raised previously in this Parliament, and I think it's timely that we're having this debate today in the name of Richard Baker. So I congratulate Richard on having brought the matter back. There is perhaps not a great deal to say about the elements of this issue that have been discussed before. In fact, we've already had it made clear there are areas in which we cannot go. So, looking at the Back Home Safe campaign, I think it is, of course, vital that everyone who is involved in travelling to the North Sea installations by helicopter has the opportunity to input into the process. And in that respect, I welcome the actions that have been taken by the Unite Trade Union in order to consult with those who are regular travellers. There is, of course, a history in the North Sea where the involvement of union activity in the industry has not always been welcome. But I think the constructive dialogue which has taken place between the trade unions and the industry in recent times is a good example of where positive relationships can be developed. Of course, there is a structure in place already to ensure that there is consultation with trade unions, and I would commend that structure and believe it should continue. However, the involvement in the Back Home Safe campaign is something which I believe highlights grassroots opinion, it highlights grassroots concern, and it is something which we should all have significant respect for. I'm glad to hear that the industry and the trade unions are engaged in a constructive dialogue, and that constructive dialogue is ongoing. But given the limitations of what we can say today, let me take the opportunity to welcome this campaign, to welcome the views that have been expressed in conjunction with that campaign, but to support the views expressed by the previous speaker that we should await outcomes from inquiries, that we should ensure that when these inquiries publish, we have swift action based on the recommendations, and that we keep that ongoing constructive engagement for as long as we possibly can.
Thank you very much. Now call on Tavish Scott, to be followed by Lewis MacDonald.
Presiding Officer, I want to thank Richard Baker for his consistency in bringing forward this matter back to Parliament this afternoon. Also to have the Minister who wound up this debate last time back in the late part of last year as well, because in fairness to Fergus Ewing, he has continuity on this issue too. And I want to assure Richard Baker that I haven't changed my thoughts about the process that we are going through on these matters. It seemed to me back when we last talked about this that there were too many discrete inquiries going. My concern about the CEA one was that they are both a regulator and they are advising on policy. Now, in fairness to them, the report that they produced earlier this week, I think is authoritative. I think many of the recommendations, as Richard Baker and Mark MacDonald and Alec Johnson have said, are extremely important. There are, I think, some questions about implementation and how quickly that is done. But I did notice, for example, the point they made with regard to OPITO training and improving survival training for offshore workers, as well as the measures that Richard Baker outlined. That seemed to me pretty important. And I also noted the remarks of UK Oil and Gas in the context of Mark MacDonald's contribution about moving these things forward as quickly as possible, and in particular the proposed Offshore Operations Safety Forum with the shared goal of improving offshore safety. I don't think anything of that takes away from the point that Richard Baker was rightly making and Unite are making around the need for a public inquiry. In the very point that both Alec Johnson and Mark MacDonald made about all the separate inquiries that are going on, it does seem to me some sense in pulling these together and to ensuring that, as has already been correctly stated, safety is absolutely number one, and the contract issues and the financial issues around contracts that the men and women who fly offshore are party to in terms of depending on are illuminated as well. And that seems to me a very reasonable observation made by many people who work in the industry, both at the most senior levels and also who simply get on helicopters day in, day out. I just want to make two final points, Deputy Presiding Officer, and that is that 3 men and a woman did die in the Super Puma helicopter crash in August of last year at Garsness off Sombra. I cannot conceive of circumstances where the families of those 3 men and women will have to wait 5 years for a fatal accident inquiry to conclude, as has already been mentioned in the context of the one that is taking place at this time with regard to the Peterhead crash in 2009. That cannot be right. We all would share that view. And I suspect we would all very strongly support Mr Ewing, the Minister with us today, if he were able to set out even a glimmer of hope that that process could be taken forward along the lines of as identified by Tricia Ferguson's Members' Bill, or in another legislative way. I'm open-minded on that, but I think we would all hope that the Minister and indeed members of all parties would come together on that in bringing those matters to a head much more quickly than has been the case in the past, just for the simple reason that I can't imagine how difficult, as Mark MacDonald rightly said earlier on, it can be to go through all those years of not quite knowing and only to find out after 5 years.
Many thanks. Now call on Lewis MacDonald, after which we'll move to the closing speech by the Minister.
Thank you very much. And I too congratulate Richard Baker on bringing this important issue for debate once again. And as a member of Unite the Union, I am also delighted at the initiative the Union has taken in bringing forward the Back Home Safe campaign. Today's death of an offshore worker reminds us that oil rigs and platforms remain inherently dangerous places to work, despite the many improvements made since Piper Alpha. But deaths on the journey to work are now the focus of concern. And every day in Aberdeen and the North East, my constituents read and hear and talk about the risks of helicopter journeys. We cannot, of course, comment on the substance of the fatal accident inquiry into the catastrophic helicopter ditching in 2009, which has just finished taking evidence in Aberdeen. And as you said, Presiding Officer, a verdict is awaited. What we can say is that relatives of those who died have had to wait far too long for that inquiry to be heard. We have seen the conclusions of the Civil Aviation Authority's review of helicopter operations published last week. Their recommendations are very welcome, although the implications for the future employment of some offshore workers will need to be carefully considered. John Taylor of Unite, who is here today, has met with MSPs at the cross-party group on oil and gas to discuss these issues on a number of occasions. And he has pointed out that many of the recommendations contained within the report cannot be enforced by the CAA, and clearly those changes will not happen unless they are agreed and can then be enforced across the sector. Other unions, such as BALPA and the RMT, have also taken a close interest in the practical issues involved. The provision of safety equipment, such as helicopter floats and rebreathing systems, will take time, as well as increased investment, and the training of North Sea workers in the use of new systems will also take both time and money. My Westminster colleague, Frank Doran, as Richard Baker mentioned, is another long-standing campaigner for better safety in the North Sea. He has called for the UK Transport Minister to convene a full-scale public inquiry into offshore helicopter operations across the whole of the UK continental shelf and to take overall responsibility for helicopter safety offshore, as currently happens in Norway. His view, and mine and those of others who have spoken, is that helicopter transport offshore needs the same detailed inquiry and fundamental review now as offshore exploration and production had 25 years ago in the form of the Cullen Inquiry. That way we can go beyond the scope of the CAA's review and look at all aspects of safe travel offshore, not least, as Tavish Scott mentioned, the regulatory role of the CAA itself. As Richard Baker said, it has taken far too long for the 2009 helicopter crash to be investigated in a fatal accident inquiry. If responsibility for a comprehensive overall review of offshore transport lies with the Department for Transport for the UK as a whole, responsibility for the operation of fatal accident inquiries lies with this Parliament and with the Scottish Government. And I hope the Minister can give us some assurance that those bereaved or affected by more recent helicopter crashes will not have to wait so long for their cases to be heard. I acknowledge the efforts made by many involved in the design, manufacture and operation of our offshore helicopter fleet to reduce the risks of future such disasters. I accept that the oil and gas industry in general is a much more safety-focused industry than it was a generation ago. But we need today a proactive approach to helicopter safety, not a reactive response to helicopter disasters. That is why we need not just urgent action on the recommendations of the CAA and on the findings of fatal accident inquiries, but also a wide-ranging public inquiry to ensure that all those in future going to work offshore will indeed come back home safe.
Many thanks. I call on Minister Fergus Ewing to close the debate on behalf of the Government. Minister.
Presiding Officer, as the First Minister reflected, our thoughts go out to the family, friends and colleagues of the man who died earlier this morning in an incident at TACA's Harding platform. Obviously, we do not yet know the full circumstances of the situation, and Police Scotland are working with TACA and other partners to determine that. However, it is a reminder, if one were needed, of the hostile conditions that our oil and gas staff work in. Presiding Officer, I congratulate Richard Baker on securing this debate following, as has been mentioned, his earlier debate very recently in the debates of this Parliament. And I'd like to begin by paying tribute to the men and women who work in the difficult and inhospitable conditions to support our oil and gas industry. Flying over the North Sea, often at night and in low visibility, presents particular challenges that we should not and must not underestimate. There are currently 95 helicopters supporting our oil and gas industry, travelling to 228 helidecks on fixed installations and up to 100 mobile installations. Annually, there are around 141,000 flights, 86,000 hours flown, and around 1 million passenger journeys. Presiding Officer, I accept your admonition with regard to not mentioning matters of substance relating to the FAI.
Guidance rather than admonition.
Indeed, Presiding Officer. So I will not do that. But let me briefly refer to incidents which have brought home the risk and challenges of operating in the North Sea. On the 18th of February 2009, an EC-225 Super Puma landed heavily on the sea whilst approaching a platform. Investigators concluded that the accident was caused by a combination of human factors, poor weather and technical problems. 18 persons were on board, and fortunately there were no fatalities. On the 1st of April 2009, an AS-332 Super Puma crashed into the sea. All 16 persons on board died. In 2012, 2 EC-225s made precautionary ditchings after indications that the main gearbox lubrication system had failed. Again, there were no fatalities. Then on the 23rd of August last year, an AS-332 crashed into the sea near Samborough. Of the 18 people on board, 4 sadly died. The passengers' flight crew and their family must have confidence that everything possible is done by regulators, aircraft operators and the oil and gas industry to minimise the risks associated with flying back and forth between platforms and heliports. Yes, certainly.
Neil Findlay.
I wonder if I could ask a general point if the Minister would support changes in the law on corporate culpable homicide, so that if there is evidence of negligence at the highest level of a company, that the individual executives or senior managers are held to account for decisions that they may have taken that have contributed to the death of any employee.
Minister.
Mr Findlay raises an extremely serious issue. With respect, it's out with the specific remit of this debate, and it is one which I will pass to the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and the Lord Advocate with the official report after this debate, and ask that he addresses that important, but with respect, separate issue. I don't think I really have time to do justice to the very complex matters associated with that today, and I would like to make some progress. Presiding Officer, it is because of the risks involved and because of the recent record, a brief summary of which I've referred to, that I very much welcome the Civil Aviation Authority's review of offshore helicopter operations, which was published last week. I made it my business prior to publication of the review to receive a briefing on the findings from senior CAA officials. It was abundantly clear to me, Presiding Officer, that an enormous amount of effort and expertise has gone into producing a set of recommendations that are designed with one objective, and that is to save lives. The work conducted by the CAA in partnership with the Norwegian Civil Aviation Authority and the European Aviation Safety Agency shows that between 1992 and 2012 there were 24 UK offshore accidents, which equates to 1 per year. The causes of accidents are evenly split between operational issues, mainly pilot performance, and technical issues, mainly rotor or transmission failure. The CAA has made a number of recommendations that will be taken as a package, lead to real improvements in safety and increase the likelihood of passengers surviving a ditching or crash on water. And I think that was one of the points Mr Baker referred to in the motion on the previous debate, and rightly so. These recommendations include restricting the sea conditions in which helicopters can fly to increase the likelihood of rescue following a ditching. The recommendations include requiring emergency breathing equipment for all passengers, and until such time as that is comprehensively available, limiting the number of passengers on board so that everyone is seated by an emergency exit window. There are also recommendations about flotation aids to prevent helicopters capsizing, and, as Tavi Scott has alluded to, recommendations in relation to better training for passengers. And better training is not a minor matter. I am advised that training in the particular conditions of evacuating in these circumstances is extremely exacting and therefore enormously important. The review also makes recommendations to EASA and aircraft manufacturers to address issues like spurious warnings which require pilots to land immediately and have led to unnecessary ditchings, and to promote improvements in helicopter vibration health monitoring systems that provide alerts of potential technical failures, a change which saw a significant reduction in crashes when it was first introduced in 1990. The key point we can take from the CAA's review is the need to implement the recommendations without delay. The CAA has made it clear that it will implement changes under its control and engage directly with other organisations and bodies such as EASA to make sure changes happen. We are also sure that the positive safety culture in the oil and gas industry will mean that the recommendations will be actions. A new offshore helicopter safety forum will be established by the CAA to drive forward the actions and recommendations identified, and we look forward to seeing how this work can improve confidence in North Sea operations. In addition, Presiding Officer, I will shortly be meeting with the Helicopter Safety Steering Group to reinforce the importance of industry progressing these actions as swiftly as possible. Presiding Officer, I wanted to respond to just a couple of the points made in the debate about the timing of the FAI. I am aware that this matter was recently dealt with by my colleague, Cabinet Secretary for Justice. I am also aware of the extremely important nature of addressing these matters. I am acutely aware, having met some of the families of the bereaved in the most recent tragedy in Sunborough, after attending a service to remember them in Aberdeen last year, that these are very sensitive and important issues. I will therefore convey to my colleague Kenny McCaskill, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, the official report of this debate and ask that he communicate with each of the members in this debate as to how he is taking these matters forward. I think I'm really coming up to close, and perhaps
Should you wish to? It's a matter
well,
for you.
in that case,
Patricia Ferguson.
Grateful to both the Presiding Officer and the Minister for taking the intervention. I just wonder, we have of course alluded to the fact that FAIs can take what seems to be an unconscionable amount of time to be held, but the other problem with FAIs is of course that their findings are not binding. So I wonder if that's something else that the Minister might like to relay to Mr McCaskill.
Minister.
Well, I'm aware of the member's close and sustained interest in this important matter. It is not one for which I have the responsibility to deal, but I do absolutely agree that these matters must be considered extremely carefully, and they shall be so considered. I just wish to conclude, Presiding Officer, by indicating my support of the Unite campaign and my endorsement of many of the sentiments expressed in the Chamber here today, my continued willingness to meet again plainly with members of Unite, BALPA, the RMT and other trade unions involved, as I have done over my period as a Minister, to continue the vital discussion about how we improve safety in the North Sea. Without that safety, there can be no effective industry. The industry does have a positive attitude to safety. The report from the CAA lays a foundation upon which we can act, and I will be discussing how those recommendations can be implemented when I meet the Helicopter Safety Steering Group very shortly.
Many thanks. Thank you to you all. And I now suspend this meeting until 2:30 this afternoon.